Welcome to this edition of the Committee on the Present Danger China's webinar series, in which we are focused on the unrestricted warfare the Chinese Communist Party has long engaged in against the United States for the purpose of our destruction. The breadth and the extent and the damage that has been caused to our country as a result of this technique of using essentially any instrument to harm us is hard to fully appreciate. Hence, the effort we have made in, I believe, now over 220 of these webinars to bring it into public light and explain how it has come to pass and the extent especially to which it is being enabled by some of our countrymen. That is the explicit focus of today's program, where we will look at, in particular, the extent to which American elites, what the Chinese have called captured elites, have been sources of technology, proprietary information, trade, and other kinds of secrets, and not least financing that has greatly enabled the Chinese Communist Party, not only to extremely impressively expand the power of its military, but to actually bring it to increasingly bear at our expense. Fortunately, thus far, not in a kinetic sense, but increasingly it is unmistakably the case in ways that threaten the vital interests of the United States and its people as well. We're going to examine this in some detail with four of the committee's most formidable and most impressive of our members. We're going to hear from three of them, thanks to the miracle of videotape, and one, the chairman of our committee, Brian T. Kennedy, is actually with us in person and will be, sort of as he often does, providing some closing comments of his own and synthesis of what others have contributed before him. Welcome. We're delighted to have you with us to talk about providing the rope, how Americans are enabling the Chinese Communist Party threat. We'll begin with comments from Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, one of America's most accomplished naval intelligence professionals. In the course of his long career, he rose through the ranks and various posts to that of Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He has continued to serve our country out of uniform, notably as the ringmaster of an extraordinarily important source of information, a Google group that goes by the name of Storm Risen. And we have, in fact, been making important use of that platform now for some time as a means of informing these programs. Captain Fennell is the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer, another of our members, of an extremely relevant book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. He is also a regular contributor to American Greatness, where you can follow his essays and great works, as well as Steve Bannon's program and ours, Securing America on the Real America's Voice channel. And in fact, this contribution from Captain Fennell is distilled from one of his recent appearances on that program, for which we're very grateful.
This idea that engaging with China would somehow be beneficial to America's national security is an idea that goes back to the first opening up of relations with China, even before that, when President Nixon was in office and we sent Henry Kissinger to China. We thought at the time, and probably correctly so, that we could use a relationship with China, the People's Republic of China, to offset our great rival at the time, 55 years ago, the Soviet Union, which was a real existential threat to us. China was militarily nothing to us, economically nothing to us, but they had geographic position on the southern border of Russia, Soviet Union, that we wanted. Fast forward to 1979, Jimmy Carter switches recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. And since that time, there has been, and there still is today, despite 2 Trump administrations that have tried to reverse this, there still remains today a large swath of our intelligentsia in Washington that believe that engaging with the People's Republic of China is necessary for a variety of reasons. Some of that was ideological because we thought that, hey, when the Soviets collapsed in 91, that therefore we were the superpower, the global superpower, lone superpower. We didn't have to worry about anybody else. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book that said the end of history, and everything was going to be in a democracy around the world, and we were going to be running everything. So there was hubris on our side. There were also many people inside our government that were sympathetic to communist ideology, socialist ideology, Democrat socialists they're called today. There's people that actually believe in that ideology and don't like the formation of the United States and our Constitution and would rather see something more like what the PRC has. And so they were vocal in supporting and promoting engagement. There were others that got into it because it was a good racket. It was a good business. It was a good way to be in academia, and you could get your papers written and your research conducted at the grace and benevolence of the People's Republic of China. Chinese Communist Party would invite you over, wine and dine you, and then you'd be expected to go back. If you wanted to continue to do that, you'd have to go back to the United States and write, glowing reports or threat-deflating reports about the risks from engaging with the People's Republic of China. And then there were just other things that went along, which was Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Communist Party. They understood what they wanted, and so they said, let's hide our weaknesses and bide our time. Biding your time means waiting until you're in a position of strength. And so they played the game very well. If they were, in Vegas, they would have been winning at the table consistently over a 40-year period, playing to our hubris, playing to our greed, playing to our laziness and sloth. Now, guess what? China is powerful. They've got this world's second largest economy. They've got the largest navy in the world. They've got the largest rocket force in the world. They got maybe the largest air force in the world, certainly the largest in the Western Pacific. And they are now exerting and using that capability to take what they claim is theirs, whether it's the 9-10 line in the South China Sea, taking Scarborough Shoal, building 7 artificial islands, threatening Japan now routinely in the Senkakus in the East China Sea and in the First Island chain, and obviously on a daily basis surrounding Taiwan and getting tighter and tighter. The noose is getting tighter and tighter around Taiwan as we keep reading about. So China is in this position because we engaged, and we had a lot of people in the uniform services where I came from in the Pentagon that bought into this because they were told by the intelligentsia, the think tanks and the academics, that you should do this because if you don't do it, it'll be thermonuclear war. And so everything that we learned in the Cold War about gradations of deterrence and conflict management from very smart people that defeated the Soviet Union, we threw all those gradations out, 100+ various levels of ways you could ratchet up or down in a superpower relationship and confrontation. And we just said, no, our academics said, no, that doesn't apply to PRC. Either we kowtow to them and appease them, or it's thermonuclear war. And so our military leaders essentially gave up on that. And they were co-opted with 40 years in the desert in the Middle East. And they said, we're not going to devote our attention to this. So the people like Andy Marshall that were always looking ahead and warning about future threats so that we never got surprised, their voices were diminished. And the voices of guys like Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who didn't care about future wars as he fired the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he said, I don't care about future wars. I want to know what you're going to do for me today. So we lost it on a lot of areas, but it was principally driven by this belief in engagement. And only since the first Trump administration and now in the second have we said, okay, we need to reverse that. And the first Trump administration was very vocal and open, especially after 2019, about what the threat from China was and speaking up about it. And COVID made it worse. In the second administration, the president's been less vocal, but his actions have been undeniably clear that he is preparing America for a confrontation with the People's Republic of China. But he's having to do that at the risk of having the engagers who are still, seeped into the sinews of our body politic, who are there that will take the president's current posture and use it as a justification. And they say, see, engagement, we got to engage. And so I think we're at risk for always having the engagers there, and we need to be on guard against that. And we should be speaking out and saying, the president leads the nation and he can lead his element of it. But at the core, we cannot engage ideologically with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, because they are anathema to what we are celebrating, especially now in this 250th anniversary of our nation, and the remembering of what we fought for in the declaration that we issued to break from Great Britain and the King. And we should never allow ourselves to be subjugated to anyone, especially the Chinese Communist Party.
Captain Tunnell, thank you as always for a very bracing analysis of how we got into the fix we're in at the moment, as well as a prescription for getting out of it, or at least not making matters worse. The idea here being that engagement on China's terms, especially, are very much at odds with vital interests of the United States. We're going to get a second opinion on these topics from another very accomplished intelligence professional. That would be Charles Sam Faddis. Sam has served both in the uniform of the United States Army and without a uniform in some very dangerous parts of the world, notably the Middle East, in the capacity of a undercover operative, a spy for the Central Intelligence Agency. He performed in that mode for some 20 years. These days, he is making a valiant and continuing contribution to our country through an online platform that is extraordinarily impressive. It is called And Magazine. You can find it at andmagazine.substack.com. Sam has, in addition to all of that, been in the law enforcement business as an assistant attorney general in Washington State. He is an attorney by training. He is also the author of a number of fiction and nonfiction works, including Beyond Repair, The Decline and Fall of the CIA. Sam also appeared on our program, Securing America and Real America's Voice, in the course of this week. And with his permission, we have excerpted part of that important interview. I commend it to all of you. It's a full hour-long program. It's really required viewing, but this is a sort of key element of it, which he spoke about the present topic, which is Americans enabling the mortal threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Let's go to the video with Sam. No.
You cannot afford wishful thinking. You can't afford, as we say, hope is not a plan. What's really happening? Where exactly do we stand? What is the danger, and what do we do now? In regard to China, the Chinese Communist Party, obviously we're not talking about the people, do not desire coexistence. They don't desire a better standard of living or any of this other nonsense. What they desire, or they are laser focused on, is world domination, supplanting us as the preeminent power on the planet and subjugating us. That's, if not ultimately physically occupying the United States, which I'm not ruling out, certainly reducing us to the status of what amounts to a vassal state, and they rule the planet. That's the reality. I'm sorry that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, and the consequences of saying that are profound, and so maybe folks just would rather dance around the issue. But again, that doesn't help anything. So this is precisely the situation we faced with the Soviet Union, right? These guys did not want to get along. They didn't want to be like us. They didn't want to become friends. They wanted to dominate the planet, and they were well on their way to doing it. And they were had built this massive military machine. We had the common sense to understand that when you're face to face with an adversary that wishes to kill you and destroy you and is every day building a bigger and bigger machine to do that you don't help him. So we didn't send money to invest in the Soviet Union. We didn't build factories in the Soviet Union when they couldn't design a tank that was much better than the ones they had in World War II. We didn't go over there and let them get our tech so they could make this better and compete with it. We maintain that laser focus. And I know you were part of this, right? This effort that ultimately culminates under Ronald Reagan and destroys the Soviet Union. But at various points under various presidents, we bobbed and weaved a little bit, whatever, but we largely maintained course on that from the end of World War II. Our approach to dealing with the communist Chinese is fundamentally different and absolutely, completely self-destructive at its core, right? We are not just not stopping them. It's not just that we're not building enough ships and tanks, which is all true, by the way. We're actually sending them all of the money to build this military machine. And we're actually not just letting them steal technology from us, but we're letting some of our biggest, the companies that produce our most advanced tech are operating in China. So we're giving them the money, we're giving them the tech, we're effectively handing them the rope with which to hang us and destroy us. And periodically we push back a little bit on this or that and impose some sanctions and express displeasure. What we don't ever do is just bite the bullet and say, look, this whole relationship has to fundamentally change. We have to stop pumping billions of dollars of investment money, trillions probably, into them. We have to stop sending our best tech there. We have to steer away from these guys and shut down this relationship fundamentally. And honestly, Frank, I find it very frustrating because we are not doing it, and there is no sign that we intend to do it. The president just flew to China not too long ago. With all respect to the president, who did he take on the plane with him? He took, a collection of whatever it was, a couple of dozen of the top guys who are at the forefront of investing in China and steering American money to the Chinese. So, that to me, we have to go, that's the essence of it. An absolute sea change in policy is required, or else the best we're doing is biding time, waiting for them to be able to destroy us. We're just buying a little more time before they can actually crush us.
Insult has been added to injury in all of this by a memorandum of understanding, not the one with Iran, back in May of 2013 between the United States and Communist China, in which we, in addition to doing the things that you've just described, we gave them access to our capital markets without requiring their companies to conform to any of our securities laws or regulations. It was a preferential treatment that no other nation, not even friendly nations, received. No American company has that authority, that latitude. Can you explain how on earth that could possibly have been done initially, let alone still apply 14, 15 years later?
I've thought about this quite a bit, Frank, and I have concluded that the awful truth is that we have individuals in the United States, fabulously wealthy, powerful individuals who are getting richer and richer and more powerful every day, doing business with the Chinese, investing, climbing in bed with the CCP has made some very powerful men incredibly powerful and rich. And when it really comes down to it, and this is sickening to me, that matters more to them than the survival of our country and the welfare of our citizens. We're not going to change course if these guys can help it, because they're getting filthy rich and they're still going to get even richer. And whatever ultimately it leads to the destruction of the United States as we know it, and that apparently is not particularly relevant to them. And I don't take any pleasure in saying that, but I don't think there's any other conclusion you can reach.
Wow. Well, there's an indictment for you, and one that I believe, coupled with all sorts of corrective action Sam is talking about, will help us chart a course going forward. We'll discuss all of that and more in a moment with Brian Kennedy. Before we do, though, one final video contribution, this one from Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, retired, man of great accomplishment, both in uniform and subsequent to moving it as a foreign service officer in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. He has been forward deployed as a businessman for quite some time in the Far East and knows his way around, both the China portfolio, of course, but also what is happening more broadly in that region. He is the author of a very important, indeed best-selling book entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. He is these days a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy and a frequent essayist in various publications, and also seen on a number of networks, including one of our favorites, NTD.
Well, glad to be here today. Many years ago, I used to do sort of research or due diligence, as so it's called, for a prominent financial institution. And often we would discover that, let's say, a company had just substantial organized crime ties. These weren't really obvious sort of public scrutiny or superficial scrutiny. And we would get detailed information, and we would then report it that, look, say, you really shouldn't do business with these people because of this, or this, and always really bad. And the answer you'd often hear was, well, are they on the OFAC list? Have they ever been charged with anything? Have they ever been caught? And usually they're not, because if you're good at this stuff, if you're sort of on the other side of the legal divide, you're not going to get caught. And most companies are not on the OFAC list. And these were all excuses, really, rationalizations to be able to do business and make money, because that's how you make money for a financial firm. You get a bonus based on the deals you complete. And nobody was all that interested some of the times, and we usually won far more often than we didn't, but there are many people who would try to rationalize whatever it was we were finding and use those excuses that, well, they've not done anything illegal, they've not been caught, they're not on any official list, despite the evidence that they were actually very problematic companies. And I'm reminded of all of this in recent times with the Chinese battery company CATL, C-A-T-L. It's the biggest battery maker in the world. It's been put on a U.S. Department of War sanctions list, and it clearly has ties to the Chinese military. And yet, in recent times, J.P. Morgan and Bank of America have helped it to raise money in an IPO in Hong Kong. And you hear some very similar explanations or excuses for it, why this isn't a problem, even though CATL is tied to the People's Liberation Army that seeks to kill Americans. And you'll hear the answers, well, it's not against the law. You'll hear things like, well, yes, it may be on the War Department list, but that doesn't mean private companies can't do business with it in private sector transactions. The War Department list only applies to government procurement, War Department procurement. And the other excuse you hear all the time, and I used to hear it all the time, was, well, everyone else is doing business with them, and other American companies do business with them, so it must be okay. And this is what you're hearing. And you hear, say, the chairman of J.P. Morgan sanctimoniously say publicly, well, if it was wrong, we wouldn't do it. And then he brings to mind Eddie Haskell on the old Leave It to Beaver cartoon, saying, well, if it's wrong, we wouldn't do it, I tell you, but we're going to make a ton of money doing this. And since it's not against the law, we're going to do it. And thus CATL raised a ton of money from thanks to U.S. companies, and that gives them access to capital, foreign currency as well. That is essential for these kind of companies, for every Chinese company, but also it gives them a degree of credibility here. Additionally, Ford, one of the great American automakers that made B-17s in World War II at industrial scale, also is doing heavy business with CATL, has moved heaven and earth to get local and federal approval to be allowed to build what is effectively a CATL factory up in the Midwest. So this it's an age-old thing, and it's that smell of money that'll make a certain type of Westerner sort of contort himself into a pretzel that we've seen forever. And this is nothing. So this is nothing new, but you're seeing it with Chinese companies that have ties to the Chinese military, and that's something that's going to take Washington some effort to crack down on it. And there's the so-called 1260H list, and you will hear as I said, you will hear the excuses why it doesn't really mean anything. You'll hear those from the private sector, even though the clear intent is that an American company, should have the decency not to do anything that helps or builds up the Chinese military. And that's your doctrine of civil military fusion that the Chinese use, where really every civilian company, well, every company in China has the obligation to cooperate with the military, and they combine the two very, very well, very effectively. And with the 1260H list that I mentioned, there's been other companies that have been added to it, things like Alibaba, BYD, the electric vehicle maker, Baidu as well. And then recently there was a big fuss that 65 new companies have been added to it. And the one question that you have to ask is that why now? Or how come it took so long? Because this has been well known, the combination, the linkage between civilian and military companies in China to further their defense. And we're finally getting around to it, a good 15, 20 years late, but nonetheless, we are getting around to it. And a couple more examples of this, of just how the company, really these Chinese companies funded by Wall Street or who helped fund them, have been very successful. Are Boeing, for example. And you'll notice that Boeing sees China as a huge market. They tagged along with the president to China, hoping to sell hundreds of aircraft. And they've been there a long time. And they rationalize it as saying, well, this is just civilian aircraft. We're just selling them sort of parts, or letting them do the finishing work. But Boeing's crown jewels, we're protecting those. Well, a Boeing aircraft works very well as a People's Liberation Army Air Force transport, as any other kind of plane does. And what the Boeing has done has helped the Chinese develop this military lift capability, and they're just providing it ready-made off the shelf. Additionally, they're putting their own technology at risk, and there's an idea that somehow you can ring-fence the technology. Well, do business in China and see how well that works. You will always be under really a full court press, and it's a successful more often than not. And remember, Boeing is a huge American defense contractor, and yet the irony here is at the same time it's helping the People's Liberation Army improve its capabilities. There's something strange in the water in too many American corporate boardrooms. You have the new Chinese aircraft, the first commercial aircraft that they've got, the C-919, and that is largely made of Western technology. The engines are product of GE Aerospace. Avionics come from Collins Aerospace. Honeywell has been in on this all the time for a long time with auxiliary power, with braking systems, etc. And yet a C-919 works very well in a military role, and also the technology and the help they provide. The Chinese can use this and use it for more direct defense purposes. The technology can be transformed, and they do it very, very well. And these are companies that use the same sort of excuses that I used to hear. Well, it's just commercial. That's not against the law. And, everyone else is doing it. If we're not in China, someone else is going to make the money, so we're going to do it. Well, they should give that argument in front of a room of lance corporals and sailors who one day are going to have to fight the Chinese. You'll remember as well when the spy balloon came over America a few years ago, that had all sorts of American technology in it. And that was able to do a lot of damage. And I would cite Texas Instruments, Iridium as well. They will say, well, it was just off the shelf, stuff we couldn't tell where it goes. Well, America's going to have to get a lot more serious about actually keeping the Chinese from getting the tools they need to build the machines that are going to destroy us. And Wall Street's role in all of this has got to change. And it is going to take some real coercion and pressure by the U.S. government. And this so-called naming and shaming is not going to be enough. Because as I said, when you get people who are willing to do business with organized crime because they can make some money, well, doing business with the Chinese Communist Party is pretty much the same thing. But it's certainly not all that different. So this is going to take a very different approach than we've taken to date. I'm not entirely optimistic about that, but we do have some good work being done by parts of the U.S. government. I would cite Representative Molinar's China Commission, for example. So once again, just some short comments on how we are going to be selling the Chinese the rope that probably isn't going to hang us. It's just going to kill us some other way. But thank you very much for having me.
Colonel Isham, as always, an extraordinarily succinct but quite comprehensive treatment of this important subject. And I think your comparison of the Chinese Communist Party to an organized crime enterprise is apt, as are your insights about what needs to be done. We're going to wrap this up with comments from our chairman, Brian T. Kennedy. Brian has been the driving force behind this enterprise from its inception, back in conversations with our mutual friend and fellow committee member, Steve Bannon. We have benefited from his contributions to many of these webinars over the years, and especially the role that he is graciously playing in this one, as well as I mentioned earlier, of helping to synthesize what we have heard and obviously contribute, in addition, some of his own important insights. Brian has been for quite some time in the public policy pantheon in the United States, notably as president of a very, very highly regarded organization, the Claremont Institute. These days, he's the president of the American Strategy Group. He is, as are our other speakers, an author of a number of books, including one that is, again, particularly relevant, China's War Inside America, from Encounter Books. Brian is a dear friend as well as a great colleague, and we're delighted to have him with us live so that we can not only hear from him, but engage in a colloquy at the end. Brian, Mr. President, as I'm fond of calling you, welcome back. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Frank. Great to be with you. We're on the eve, practically speaking, of the 4th of July, our 250th anniversary. And so I've been thinking, as with a lot of my Claremont colleagues, on what the American founders would have thought of the crises we're in today. We have a number of these crises here in the United States: illegal immigration, a government that seems unchecked by the Constitution, and so many other things on a cultural or a more in a way civilizational basis. Just when it comes to the American civilization, things that cause us crises here at home. And so I've been thinking about what would the founders have thought about this problem with the Communist Chinese Party that we find ourselves in today. I think they would not have been surprised by this. Frankly, that we would be in this predicament that Captain Fennell and Sam and Grant just outlined, that there would always be these people who would, just for money, do whatever they could to make money. And that, in a way, is not surprising. That's human nature to make money. But then we also have this example of the American founding. We're about to celebrate our 250th anniversary here, 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And when that Declaration was signed, not everybody, as we know, was for it. There was probably 30% of the country that were openly in favor of independence. And there was probably 30 that were pretty, maybe somewhat supportive, but, kind of neutral on the question. And then we have 30% that were adamantly opposed, what we would call Tories or loyalists to the British Crown. And you look at this great experiment in American democracy, in this republic of ours, and you think, well, who couldn't have been for this? Well, a lot of people were not for this in the beginning. It took a while for them to understand that we could separate from the British Crown, that we could become an independent nation, that we could rule ourselves. Those that 30% that were in favor of independence, even there was probably, as it's often, the numbers often used, of maybe only 3% of them were driving all of this forward. So a small group of people believed in these principles of human freedom and were driving it forward. And they were driving it forward against that 30% of the loyalists who were deeply committed to the British Crown. Well, it seems to me we're in a similar spot today, where we have the American people. They still believe in freedom. The everyday people believe in freedom. They're willing to fight and die for freedom. And that 3% number is probably now 30%. It's a big number are in favor of that. And you probably have another 30 or 40% that are in love with the country, the United States, and are going to do anything they can to support it. Then you have 30% that are today not in favor of what the United States stands for. They believe in a radical ideology. They've been taught in American schools, unfortunately, for almost a century, that America is a bad, corrupt country, and that it really is, beneath contempt in so many ways. And then there's a 3% on that side, and those are our elites. And those elites are not loyal to the United States. These are the people that, unfortunately, President Trump took on the plane with him to China, as Sam was pointing out. They're loyal to themselves, and they're loyal to their corporations, and they're not loyal to the country. They're loyal to whatever makes them money. And if they think communist China will make them money, they'll do whatever is in their power, including trying to influence this administration, to get their way. They will tell the stories of how our economy will crater if we don't do business with communist China. And then you have President Trump, who's trying to navigate these waters of trying to both combat the Chinese Communist Party and then bring America, as it were, along with him to a kind of reorganization, as it were, of the United States from what's really become an empire to a republic. And so you have that 3% who of our business elites, corporate elites, Wall Street, what have you, but also the media elites and others who don't care for the country, are happy to make a dollar, and are loyal, as it were, to a globalist kind of empire, which is really what America has become. We're no longer, as it were, a republic. We're more of an empire. And that's the thing President Trump is trying to reorganize. He's trying to take us from an empire that would, go around the world in what he called endless wars, that would export our jobs overseas because that was somehow good for the global empire. And he's trying to bring those jobs back home. He's trying to get rid of that empire and bring back a republic into this country, to where our founders conceived of us as. A republic that would do things that were good for the United States, first and foremost, and good for the people of the United States. When we export jobs to China, for instance, and we build all the things we do in communist China, that's very good for the Chinese people. And it's very good for the Chinese Communist Party. Not so good for the American people, but very good for those people that are loyal to what I've been calling the American empire, an empire that seeks to organize the world in along the interests of that 3% of our business and corporate elites, but not beneficial to the rest of the country that has to, raise our families and fight our wars. Not so beneficial to them. This is the condition we find ourselves in here, that we've been told that all of this system of ours, where we export our jobs and we have cheap imports into the United States, we've been told that's a good thing, very beneficial to the American people, we've been told. And that dominated for the last 30 or 40 years. And now you have President Trump, and he's trying to reorganize that, as I'm arguing, along a much different line. He's trying to bring jobs back. He's trying to strengthen the U.S. military. He's trying to focus our efforts not on going abroad, but when we have to, but strengthening the United States internally, strengthening the Western Hemisphere, making sure that we're defended. Now, frankly, we're not going fast enough, in my opinion. We're not rebuilding the military fast enough. We're not building national missile defenses, for instance, fast enough. We're not building our offensive nuclear forces fast enough. But we're on track, let's hope, or getting on track, let's say, to get that done. That's a lot to do so that we can focus on the American people and what is good about the United States, and making us the preeminent military and economic power in the world. We don't need to be concerned about making everyone else wealthy. We need to be concerned about making ourselves wealthy. And we need to forego those 3% elites, as I'm calling them, and their interests. Their interests are not the interests of the American people. And so when you combine the power of the elites really to dominate both our politics and our media, President Trump has a big task before him. He understands that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat to the United States. Whatever else he may say, he often uses rhetoric that makes it sound like we're friends with them or that we can do business with them. And he does want to have friendly relations, but that's different than being friends. He understands that they're an existential threat, and he's taking the necessary steps to make it a reality to rebuild the United States along lines that would make us secure for the indefinite future. But he does that, this is really, I think, the theme of this webinar, at a time when so many people are willing to forego the security of the United States just for money. And they would sell out the country to communist China. And President Trump has a Republican Party that is still themselves wed to this idea of empire rather than a republic. They're still willing to do business with communist China rather than bringing jobs home here to the United States. And so we're the task before President Trump and before the Committee on the Present Danger China and before the MAGA movement is, can we find men and women politically who support that point of view? We have the people who believe those things, but we don't have elites politically on we'll call it the political right or the MAGA right, who actually are capable of following through and supporting President Trump. President Trump, just parenthetically, can't get the SAVE Act passed through the U.S. Senate, which has a majority of Republicans, because they're still wed to this idea that we have to do business with the entire world, and we're not going to do anything to actually take the necessary steps to rebuild the American Republic. And that sounds like that's a bit incongruous, but trust me, it's not. John Thune and the Republicans do not believe in the kind of arguments we're making here today about the threat from communist China and the need to strengthen America. And so we have a big task before us. I think both President Trump and the committee here that you and I are part of, Frank, that we have to persuade the American people that if we don't get this right now, that all is going to be lost. The same way that the George Washington and the American founders had to persuade their countrymen at the time that if they didn't separate from England, that they were not going to be able to develop here in North America the way they wanted. They were not going to be free people deciding for themselves how they're going to govern themselves. We're in that exact same spot. Right now, we are suffering a long train of abuses from the U.S. government that is not defending the United States, that is not making sure that our military is the absolute best in the world, that we're not exporting abroad the technology and intellectual property of the American people that they have developed in order to make other countries rich. We have to stop that and make sure that we're focusing on what makes us wealthy. And we only want that wealth so that the American people enjoy prosperity and security, and that they're capable of defending themselves against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think the crisis we're facing today, and it's highlighted by this inability to understand the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, is every bit as serious as any that has faced the country. Perhaps more so because the stakes are even greater today. And we have an enemy in communist China that is extremely powerful, that is extremely wealthy in their own way. I mean, a lot of people talk about how they're, ready to collapse, and I pray they do collapse. But we have to count on that they're powerful and wealthy and capable, and they do seem very hardworking and very determined. And whatever problems they may have, they're very good at solving those problems, and they play the long game. And they can wait out President Trump if they have to, because they think over time that the American elites that I've described, that 3% who are part of our business and media complex, that they're ultimately going to be on the side of communist China. And it's our job to prove them wrong, to actually explain to the American people that their freedom requires that they take on the Chinese Communist Party, to understand the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And they need not make war against them, but they need to have a military that is second to none and that deters the Chinese Communist Party, and an economy that is built around the wealth and prosperity of the American people as a whole, first and foremost, not just that 3%. And so on this eve of the 4th of July, Frank, I think it's important for Americans to understand that. And I look forward to working with you in the future to make sure that all Americans appreciate that. So thank you, Frank.
All right, thank you. And I so appreciate, especially, the historical grounding. You're absolutely right to be making the point as we prayerfully set the stage. We hope for the next 250 years that we understand both where we've come from and where we've deviated from some of the practices that have not only made this country great and exceptional, but made it secure and able to provide for the prosperity as well as the well-being of its people. I wanted to noodle with you a few things, Brian, that sort of come out of all of this, various presentations, your closing comments. Try, hopefully, in so doing, to further define the challenge that we face and what must be done about it. Let me start, as I probably should have said this in the introduction, but there were two things that took place in the course of this month of June that prompted a focus on the topic of the day. One was that the Pentagon as I think Colonel Newsom pointed out, not only has this list of what are called, quote, Chinese military companies operating in the United States, unquote. It's popularly known as the 1260H list. The Pentagon added 17 companies to that list earlier this month, and those are parent companies. They also added something like 48 subsidiaries of parent companies that had been on that list previously. Question to you, Brian. Why is it that we have Chinese military companies operating in the United States? Any of them, let alone, the point that's been made by, again, I think Colonel Newsom, that every company in China has a duty to honor the civil military fusion doctrine of the Chinese Communist Party. So really, every company, a great many of whom are operating in this country, would fall under the same rubric. Why is it that we are indifferent to the danger that obviously represents?
The most obvious answer is we're engaged in massive self-deception about the threat. Maybe that's too easy to say, but look, how many people within the American establishment simply believe war will never come between the United States and China? That's true of, even though this Pentagon understands the threat and is doing something about it, how many people within the U.S. government, within the U.S. Congress, within Wall Street and the corridors on K Street, the offices on K Street there in Washington, D.C., they believe war will never come between the United States and China. We're all making too much money, they think. And because we're all making money, they think that, people like Frank Gaffney and the Committee on the Present Danger of China, they're just tilting against windmills. That's all just talk. And even though China builds advanced nuclear weapons and they build missile defenses and they build very advanced space capabilities and fighter aircraft and what have you, that war will never come. And you have a guy like Donald Trump, and he's talking tough, but at the end of the day, this too will pass, and that our economies are just so intertwined, the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy, that at the end of the day, we'll realize that war is such a distant possibility that we should just all get along. We should all make money. We should further intertwine our economy with theirs. If Chinese corporations want to operate in the United States and make money, good for them, good for us. We're making money, all is well.
Even military companies.
Even military companies, because they think, well, what does it matter if war never comes?
Let me ask you, Brian, because it's been a hardy perennial of these various conversations to point out, as I said at the very beginning, war has come. We are in a war. It is an unrestricted warfare, to be sure, and has been going back, I think, to the 1990s. But it's also more contemporaneously been described by the Chinese, I think it was in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, that a people's war has been declared against us by the CCP. We don't have to speculate whether that is so. That is what the People's Daily, the main propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party, had in its pages, as I recall, in May of 2019. Is this really cognitive dissonance? That we're making so much money and therefore we don't want to see the threat and therefore we don't see the threat? Or is something else operating, Brian? Have we gotten to a point, do you think, perhaps, where there's actually a loyalty to the other party, in this case, the enemy, that is now prompting people to behave as they are, not just, greed?
Practically speaking, yes, it is loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, practically speaking. Of course, what they would think is they're not so much loyal to the Chinese Communist Party as to a globalist system that seems to be working for the United States. We're the wealthiest country on earth, and yet we're the ones who've been advancing this style of economic behavior for about a half a century, right? And so they think this must be working. And so if it's working, let's just keep it going. And so they're loyal in part, they're loyal practically to the Chinese Communist Party, but really loyal to this idea of globalism. And Trump's an anti-globalist, just to be clear. But this globalism is still part of the U.S. government and the Trump administration. Unfortunately, their failure to actually press hard enough on all of these Chinese corporations that are doing business here, the Chinese nationals that are here in the United States. I mean, the litany of things that we've described on these webinars, from 200,000 Chinese nationals that came during Biden that look to be men of military age, to Chinese corporations that are operating here, military corporations, but regular Chinese corporations or Chinese cutouts that are buying up U.S. farmland, especially around U.S. military installations, Chinese espionage that goes on here. There's still estimated $600 billion a year being stolen in American intellectual property by communist China. Your point about the war continuing, that's absolutely right. And so it's massive self-deception on the part of the Americans that this continues. And the Chinese look at this, by the way, with a kind of contempt. They think to themselves, how stupid are these Americans that they would let this happen, that they would let the Chinese Communist Party steal their intellectual property with impunity, that they would buy up our land with impunity. This is frankly a scandal, and working our way out of this is not an easy task. It's very difficult. I mean, they have certain advantages with their rare earth minerals and certain parts of their economy that are still necessary for the U.S. economy. And so building our way out of this is going to take a while.
Yeah. Let me just ask you another question, Brian, on this point of, course corrections. And,
right.
There's no getting around it. That there's enough inertia as well as, perceived self-interest to cause people to say, well, we're not going to do this. We're certainly not going to do this anytime soon. But one of the things that has popped up that, again, prompted this webinar is in retaliation for the additions to the 1260H lists by the Pentagon, the Chinese Finance Ministry, I think on the 22nd of June, announced retaliatory measures. And they said that government agencies of People's Republic of China would no longer be allowed to acquire the products of, I believe it was 46 specified U.S. companies. And what popped out for many of us looking at that list was those companies included Lockheed Martin, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, and Raytheon, four of the largest and most important U.S. defense contractors. And again, the question occurs, Brian, what is it that U.S. defense contractors are selling to the Chinese, and to what end? And what other interactions are taking place that might actually create vulnerabilities that are exploited by the Chinese to the detriment of our military and national security, sir?
Well, Frank, as you well know, during the Cold War, we didn't have this view. We didn't believe in selling sensitive materials to the Soviet Union because we were in a Cold War with them, and they presented an existential threat. We don't have that way of thinking with Communist China. And so we don't have within our government the apparatus in place to make sure that such transfers of technology, sales of sensitive equipment, is forbidden with Communist China. Again, this is massive self-deception on our side. That's the only thing to account for it. There's no reasonable way of thinking about this, unfortunately. It's not like we can make the argument that selling, sensitive military technology to Communist China from a Raytheon or a Lockheed or a Boeing, we can't make the argument that that's somehow good for the United States. We're doing it because we're engaged in self-deception. We don't believe we're in a war with them, even though they believe we're in a war with us. And even though President Trump believes this, and I keep coming back to President Trump because so many on our side will say, well, look, President Trump understands the threat. Why isn't this being stopped? He's one man, and he's doing everything he can to get certain things put in place, but he doesn't have an administration that is capable of taking that understanding and turning that into operational policy throughout the government to make sure those sales aren't going on. And until we get that understanding held government-wide throughout the U.S. Congress and throughout all of Wall Street and Washington, until that understanding is fixed in their heads that they present an existential threat to the United States, until we do that, we are going to be enabling the Chinese Communist Party and their military to become, over time, the preeminent power on earth. And we do that, obviously, in a suicidal way. That's the only rational way we can think about it.
I want to come back to the policy issue and the president's efforts there, Brian, in just a moment. But I just have to say, I know I have, and I think you have as well, had friends and colleagues, people that we have worked with, people who we admire, who are in those various companies that I've mentioned or have been in the past. It does seem if anybody on the planet should understand the nature of the threat we're facing from the Chinese Communist Party and its People's Liberation Army, it would be the employees and leadership, for that matter, of Lockheed Martin, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. They're people who are working intimately with our intelligence services and certainly with our military. They're under no illusion of the nature of the threat, I have to believe, and yet they are clueless, I guess, or just, motivated by the opportunity to profit from selling products. Either way, it's a practice that has to be corrected. And I hope that this program and our kinds of thinking will penetrate, at the very least, those defense contractors and the people overseeing them in the government. But let me come back to the policy issue that you've just raised, Brian, because it's the heart of another aspect of this that has been so vexing for our committee from its inception back in, I believe, 2019. And that is that we have on the books still a memorandum of understanding. I talked about it a little bit with Sam Faddis, whereby then Vice President Joe Biden helped engineer essentially unlimited access for Chinese companies, including Chinese military companies, to our capital markets. So it's not just that we've been selling stuff, including perhaps in significant ways. You've, I think, said $600 billion worth of intellectual property is either migrating legally, being sold above board, or being stolen. But these folks on Wall Street have been underwriting, providing the rope, as we say, in terms of at least financing its purchase, as well as what is being done in the technology space and in the military. What are we to make of the fact that this memorandum of understanding remains on the books, even after all this time, and even after President Trump in February of last year promulgated something that he called the America First investing policy as a means of correcting this practice, ending the kind of sweetheart arrangements that the Chinese uniquely enjoyed, and the financing to the tune, by some estimates, of maybe $5 or even $6 trillion by American public pension funds, mutual funds, exchange traded funds, individual investors and their life savings, and so on. A good bit of which has helped underwrite, among other things, the People's Liberation Army's military buildup. So the question on policy, this has not been implemented in any way, as far as I can tell, the American First investment policy. Why not, in your estimation, sir? And should it now be fully?
It should be fully implemented, absolutely. Look, I think you've answered the question, though, in a way. If it's $5 or $6 trillion that U.S. investors have put into Chinese companies, and we implement that policy, that means we have to unwind $5 or $6 trillion of investments from communist China back to presumably other investments. And that process of unwinding, let's say at the high end, $6 trillion of investments, means that the stock market, in theory, because I think most of these Chinese stocks are either fraudulent, overvalued, and what have you, if we unwound them, that $6 trillion may only turn out with liquidation to maybe $1 trillion or less. That means the U.S. stock market is going to take, just logically speaking, a $5 trillion hit. And any president or secretary of the Treasury or Treasury Department or Commerce Department is not going to want to see a $5 trillion hit to the U.S. stock market. And people like you and me don't want to see that $5 trillion hit either necessarily, but we know that the current system can't continue, where we have U.S. investors, moms and dads around the country who are putting their money faithfully in retirement accounts, going to communist China through mutual funds. That's what's going on today. And either we decide to take the hit and quit funding the Chinese Communist Party and all of its corporations, or we continue down this path where we are going to simply finance our own destruction. That's where we are. And it's going to be a painful process, to be sure, this unwinding from communist China, but it's absolutely necessary. And I think President Trump believes in it, but doing it in an orderly way so as to cause minimal disruption and economic hardship to the American investor is, I think, what he's shooting for here. And again, not so easy to do that unwinding, but it has to be done. And I think it will be done. I pray it will be done over time.
Yeah. Well, I think you put your finger on the point. That is this indeed the object of his policy, to unwind, to disengage, to decouple, whatever term you wish to use. And let me put an even finer point on it, Brian, because I think in a way you've alluded to it in your remarks about, sort of our historic position at this moment. I hope people are taking away from this presentation that we do have an enemy set on our destruction, beavering away to bring it about through a whole variety of means, unrestricted warfare means, and is doing so with considerable effect. I think it has to be said. Over the years, certainly, the damage done, just the fact that we are so coupled and so dependent and so bereft of industrial capabilities or manufacturing of some of these critical things like chips and pharmaceuticals and batteries and stuff. in no small measure thanks to this unrestricted warfare. But my question to you is this, Brian. Is there really, at the end of the day, any substitute for ending the Chinese Communist Party and the misrule that it has inflicted upon its own people, for these decades, since 1949? Or is there some basis upon which we can decouple? Yes, but having made the investments, having provided the technology, having enables the military buildup, that this enemy will remain and almost certainly will be continuing aggressively to pursue their ambition, which is to take out us, our country, our form of government, our counterweight to their ambitions and capabilities. I guess I just would ask you to sort of say, what is the point of decoupling? Is it in the end to bring about, as my old boss Ronald Reagan achieved with the last communist, totalitarian threat that sought our destruction, the Soviet Union, to put the CCP, as he would put it, on the ash heap of history?
Great question, Frank. I don't know, frankly, whether we're going to be able to bring down the Chinese Communist Party through any of our sort of active measures there in Communist China. It seems to me the way you bring down the Chinese Communist Party is having a strong United States, and we're not strong enough today. It seems to me the focus of our efforts should be more on how do we fix the United States. If you fix the United States, if you get right the policies that have weakened us, meaning the exporting of jobs abroad, if you bring those jobs back home, if you invest in the American military, if you invest internally in the United States, if you get people to be invested again, as it were, in the success of the United States, meaning the American people, if you get them invested in what makes this country great, meaning everybody has a job, who wants a job, who needs a job. If you start rebuilding our industrial base, if you start increasing home ownership, if you do those things, improving education, sort of the litany of things that would be part of domestic internal improvement. If you do that, and we're strong, and we understand as a people that we have enemies abroad, and we become the focus of human excellence here in the United States, it won't matter what communist China does. They're going to do what they do. They're going to repress their own people. They're going to seek to dominate Asia. They're going to seek, as always, to destroy the United States. We're not going to be able to slow them down, per se, without fixing things here in our country. Without changing the mindset of the people within the United States, we're not going to slow them down. We have to quit investing in communist China and sending our retirement dollars and putting them in their corporations. Let's start there. Let's start with building things here in the United States again, employing Americans. We do all of those things. Ultimately, it seems to me that will force communist China to change or to weaken, or at minimum to persuade them that it will be foolish to try to destroy the United States. But so long as there is only a, unfortunately, small number of us who understand the threat from communist China is winning. Today, let me say, communist China is winning. And that has to stop.
I disagree. And it does have to stop. Brian, I would just add to that powerful summation. One of the things that has to change, if it is to stop, is we have to end the practice of Americans enabling the Chinese Communist Party, not just to persist, but of course to actually become ever more dangerous and ever more convinced that it will prevail. And I would just like to mention in that regard, a shameless plug, the book that came out of, I think, the first 70 or so of these webinars, co-authored by me and our colleague Didi Logason, entitled The Indictment, Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. And the point of the book, Brian, as you know, is that we have this cohort of people who are, been describing it throughout this program, enabling the enemy at a minimum, if it is not actually made illegal to do that, which I believe it should be the state of affairs. But the people who are profiting and being enriched by all of this have lobbyists. And they spend enormous amounts of money ensuring that it remains legal to aid and abet our mortal enemy. If they're not going to be guilty of actual illegal activity as a result of those efforts, at the minimum, in what I call the court of public opinion, they need to be prosecuted for betraying our country and imperiling all of us, including, by the way, them and their families and their loved ones. It's almost unimaginable that people would be indifferent to those considerations. But there does seem to be, Brian, as you know, as a student of history, this conceit on the part of people who betray their countries that they will profit from doing so, not just in the present moment and in a pecuniary sense, but if the other side actually wins, they will be in an advantaged position. Generally speaking, I think history shows that what actually happens to them is they are the first taken up against the wall and shot by that new regime. So they should be mindful of that. But if none of that matters, at the minimum, I think the fact that they are regarded by their countrymen and women as people betraying all of us is something that has to be part of the predicate here, the course corrections that you've described, Brian, and our other colleagues. So it has to start there, it seems to me, or you're not going to get very far because you're working against an enemy within. Let me simply say thank you, Brian, for this opportunity to have a wholesome exchange with you, as well as to hear from Jim Fennell, Sam Faddis, and Grant Newsham in the course of this program. I hope all of you found it as illuminating as I did, and will help us disseminate this program as widely as possible, because I think both the problem, our analysis of it, and the recommended correctives urgently need the attention of every American, especially if at this very important moment we aspire to have another 250 years to be celebrated with even more prosperity and accomplishments and pride in our country at that next important milestone. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America. Over and out.